Shape and object perception. The processes described earlier compute piecemeal representations of visual structure containing information about the local features present at different places in the image. This representation is sometimes called the primal sketch because it provides a simple description of local image features. However, most visual tasks, such as recognition and visually guided action, require sophisticated representations of discrete, meaningful objects rather than an unstructured patchwork of locally encoded detail. Theories of visual processing therefore propose at least two further levels of analysis after the primal sketch, and to create a three-stage model of shape and object processing. In the second stage, the visual system builds a representation of the larger scale shapes and surfaces visible in the scene. In the third stage, the visual system constructs representations of the objects present in the scene. And so stage one, we have the image. Stage one would be local features. Stage two would be shape representation. And stage three would be object representation. 3 stages of visual processing. The first stage builds a piecemeal representation of local image properties. The second stage builds a representation of larger scale shapes and surfaces. That's why it's called shape representation. And the third stage matches shapes and surfaces with stored object representations to achieve recognition. And that's why it's called object representation. There is some evidence that people with scotomas, for example, can, when pressed, reveal access to some primitive perceptual representation, probably in subcortical structures. And, of course, we have neuropsychological evidence, case studies which provide general support for the 3-stage model of visual analysis. And I won't go into that. I will introduce a key term called agnosia, which is a clinical condition characterized by disordered visual perception of shapes and or objects. We also have proximity and similarity in shape representation. We have the proximity, how close it is to you or from you. Similarity of color, if it looks color similar to the color that another person might think it is. Similarity of size, and then common fate, as well as good continuation. The Gestalt psychologist did not actually describe a grouping law based on common disparity, perhaps because the nature of this cue was not fully understood at the time. Of course, Gestalt is a German word whose closest English equivalents are pattern, shape, or configuration. And so the Gestalt movement began with the work of Wertheimer in Germany in the early part of the 20th century. And then we have basic silhouettes of objects, for example, can be seen as being sufficient for recognition, demonstrating the importance of bounding contours in object representation. So we could have the shape of the object, not the details, just the shape of the object for representation purposes. We have parsing, which is a process that divides input signals into discrete, meaningful units. Generic viewpoint, which is a viewpoint providing a perspective on an object that is typical of many other viewpoints. And accidental viewpoint, a viewpoint providing a highly unusual and perhaps unique perspective on an object. And then view-independent representation. View-independent representation, an object representation that reflects only the intrinsic structure of the object, also known as an object-centered representation. And then view-dependent representation. View-dependent representation is an object representation that reflects the structure of the object as seen from a specific point of view, also known as the viewer-centered representation. So we have the view-independent representation, which is known as the object-centered representation, and the view-dependent representation, which is also known as the viewer-centered representation. And of course, there are different stages of object representation. How images can be very different, however, and still depict the same object. or you could have a collection of objects illustrating the various tasks that require object representations, recognition, interaction. It could be, for example, recognition that a mug versus a jug. It could be a discrimination, my mug versus your mug, or an interaction, pour the milk from a jug into a mug. And, of course, then we have view-independent theories, as well as view-dependent theories. We have also what's called shape space, which is a multi-dimensional metric space representing variations in object shape. Each shape occupies a specific location in the space, and similar shapes occupy nearby locations. And that's called shape space. And then there's a neural basis of object representation. Recognition by interpolation between a novel object, new and stored prototypical views. Each prototypical animal shapes occupy a specific location in a multidimensional representation space. Again, remember we talked about shape space. The distance between prototypical shapes reflects their similarity, the similarity of a viewed shape. For example, an animal to stored prototypes is measured by their distance apart in the shape space. For example, an animal may be more similar to another animal than to another animal. And of course, we have object representation. And then getting to scene perception. Scene perception is the last. The theories recognition discussed in the preceding section take no account of the visual context in which objects appear. Objects are almost never encountered in complete isolation, but appear in the context of a larger scene, and many studies have found that objects in a consistent or familiar background scene are processed more quickly and recognized more accurately than those seen against an inconsistent background. Of course, we have the chapter summary. Higher levels of processing in spatial vision can be divided into two broad stages: shape representation and object representation. Concerning shape representation, Gestalt laws describe the tendency for image elements to be grouped together on the basis of such properties as proximity, similarity, common fate, and good continuation. Gestalt laws reflect the properties of real-world objects such as cohesiveness and opacity. Shape segmentation can be achieved using texture analysis, common motion and depth properties, and symbolic grouping. Shape representation may also involve a parsing operation to link together disparate shapes that belong to the same partially occluded object surface. Motion, depth, and T-junctions of contours are powerful parsing cues. Concerning object representation serve several purposes: recognition of an object as belonging to a general class, discrimination of particular objects within a class, and the interaction with objects. Object processing is computationally difficult because images of objects reflect both intrinsic factors and extrinsic factors. Theories of object processing differ in how they deal with extrinsic factors. View-independent theories propose that the visual system removes all extrinsic influences to create a structural description of objects in terms of their component parts and the relations between parts. View-dependent theories store objects in terms of a few discrete prototypical views. Recognition involves comparing a novel two-dimensional view against stored views of known objects in order to find the closest match. Neurophysiological evidence favors view-based theories. Object processing is mediated by the ventral pathway, and cells in area IT appear to have view-based stimulus preferences. However, view independence may arise in higher-order cell populations. Concerning scene perception, background context is known to facilitate object recognition, either by activating representations of objects that are likely to occur together in a scene or by rapid categorization of scene gist. Research on inattentional blindness has found that very little is retained about a scene from one glance to the next, apart from gist and the layout. And of course, there are Bayesian models using Bayesian logic of visual perception. And they're just Bayesian probabilities for the shapes. You could have, for example, cube, prism, pyramid, tetrahedron. You could have image containing arbitrary geometrical shape and 4 three-dimensional objects that could all have given rise to it. And of course, there's Bayes' rule. So there could have function diagram for a Bayesian inference system in sensory processing. Decisions about features and objects are made by combining knowledge about the world, or priors, with the sensory evidence, the likelihoods, using what's called Bayes' rule, or Bayes' rule. Next, we will go into depth perception.